The storm moved across the open land like a living force, swallowing fences, trails, and the horizon in a wall of white. Wind roared across the plains, carrying shards of ice that cut through layers of fabric and stung any exposed skin. Snow piled in uneven drifts, rising and falling like frozen waves beneath a sky that had turned gray and merciless. Nothing survived long in weather like this. Not cattle, not travelers, and certainly not the thin, exhausted girls stumbling through the gale. They moved in a tight cluster, heads bowed, sleeves pulled over trembling hands. Each breath came as a shallow gasp, lost instantly to the wind. Their clothes, never meant for a blizzard, clung to their bodies with a cold that had already seeped into their bones. The guards who had marched them earlier were nowhere in sight now. The storm had separated them, then erased all traces. What remained were the Japanese POW girls, stranded and shrinking beneath the violent sweep of winter. Hoofbeats broke through the howl. 3 cowboys emerged from the whiteout, their shapes blurred by blowing snow until they drew close enough for their outlines to sharpen. Thick coats, wide hats iced over, ropes hanging from saddles. They had been searching for stray cattle, but froze at the sight before them, stunned by how small and fragile the girls looked against the vast, brutal land. The cowboys dismounted quickly, moving with urgency rather than fear. One reached for the nearest girl, lifting her with careful arms, but the moment his hands touched her, her legs buckled. She collapsed against him, not from trust, but from sheer collapse, her body giving out in a way that startled them all. Another girl fell soon after, sinking into the snow without resistance. The men exchanged shocked glances. This was more than exhaustion. Something deeper lived behind the girls' terror, something that made even rescue feel overwhelming. Snow hammered the old barn roof as the cowboys carried the weakened girls inside, closing the heavy doors against the blizzard's roar. The sudden quiet felt strange after the storm's violence, a thick, whiteout silence that settled over the room like frost. Lantern light flickered across stacked hay, tools, and saddles hung on worn beams. The girls huddled near the far wall, shivering beneath blankets the cowboys had thrown over their shoulders, their breaths thin and uneven as they tried to understand where they had been taken. The men spoke in low tones near the entrance, confusion etched across their faces. None of them had expected panic at a simple touch. They had lifted injured ranch hands, lost travelers, even trapped horses, but never had someone collapsed as if rescue itself were a threat. One cowboy removed his hat, running a hand through hair damp with melted snow, trying to piece together what he had seen. The girls had not fought. They had not spoken. They had simply folded into themselves as if every movement toward them carried danger. From the corner, faint whispers rose between the prisoners. Their voices were soft, urgent, shaped by warnings learned long before winter overtook the plains. They spoke of American men the way others might speak of storms, unpredictable, overwhelming, capable of harm even without intent. Some kept their eyes fixed on the floor, too frightened to look up. Others watched the cowboys with wide, fearful glances, as if any sudden shift might confirm the myths they carried. The barn's warmth did little to bridge the distance between them. The cowboys' concern pressed against the girls' terror. creating a quiet divide that neither side knew how to cross. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, a deeper uncertainty settled. What had shaped fear so strong it survived even rescue? He stood apart from the others, leaning against a wooden beam, while the lantern glow softened the shadows stretching across the barn floor. The lead cowboy kept his hat low, not out of habit, but out of consideration, sensing how every sharp movement unsettled the girls clustered in the corner. He watched them with the quiet focus of a man who had spent years reading storms, cattle, and the subtle warnings of the land. Now he tried to read fear in human form, tracing the small signals that revealed more than any words could. Each girl reacted differently, yet all carried the same edge of hypervigilance. When a saddle creaked, one flinched so violently that her blanket slipped from her shoulders. When a cowboy shifted his boots, another pulled her knees to her chest, as though bracing for impact. Even the flicker of lantern light seemed to startle them, their eyes darting toward shadows as if expecting danger to emerge from the dark corners. Their breaths came shallow and fast, the kind drawn by people who had learned to expect harm before help. The cowboy felt something tighten in his chest as he studied them. He had seen fear before, during blizzards, during stampedes, but never fear that grew stronger in safety than in danger. He noticed how they avoided looking at the men, how their bodies curved inward, creating small barriers of their own making. When his fellow cowboy knelt to adjust a blanket, one girl shrank so quickly she almost disappeared behind another. Duty told him they needed care. The blizzard would take them if the cold didn't. But empathy told him that rushing toward them, even with good intentions, would only harden their terror. He felt the weight of that conflict settle on his shoulders, heavier than the storm outside. He didn't know their history, didn't know the warnings that shaped every tremble, yet he sensed that whatever had taught them, this fear ran deeper than weather or captivity. He stayed where he was, choosing stillness over strength, humility over action. For now, watching quietly was the only kindness he knew how to offer. They sat in a tight circle near the barn wall, blankets drawn close, their whispers threading through the cold air with the fragile tension of memories too heavy for their voices. The storm outside muffled most sounds, but their quiet words carried far enough for the truth to take shape, not in detail, but in tone. Fear did not begin here on the plains. It had traveled with them, crossing the ocean long before the blizzard found them. They had grown up hearing stories about Americans whispered in classrooms, shelters, and recruitment halls. Tales of soldiers who punished weakness. Tales of captors who exposed girls to humiliation the moment they fell into enemy hands. Some stories claimed that being touched meant surrendering dignity forever. Others insisted that captivity led to public shame, that foreign men looked at prisoners not as people but as trophies of war. None of the girls had ever seen these things, but the warning settled into their minds the way winter settled into the land. Quiet at first, then absolute. They spoke about those warnings now, voices barely louder than the lantern flame. One girl recalled hearing that Americans would drag captives by their arms, pulling them into the open for others to judge. Another remembered a teacher insisting that if an American ever lifted you off the ground, It meant you would never return home with honor. The myths varied, but they converged into one truth the girls carried without question. A stranger's hands were more dangerous than any storm. So, when the cowboys had lifted them from the snow, their bodies had responded before thought could intervene. Collapse had been instinct, not choice, a desperate attempt to retreat from everything they had been taught to fear. The barn was warm now, but the shadows held the shape of old warnings that refused to fade. The cowboys tried again as the wind outside beat against the barn walls, shaking loose flecks of frost that drifted into the lantern light. They moved with deliberate caution, carrying extra blankets, a tin cup of warm water, and a pair of coats pulled from the tack room. None of them spoke above a whisper. They knew the girls startled easily, knew every sound felt sharper in a place where fear lived closer to the skin than the cold. One cowboy stepped forward first, stopping a full stride away before lowering a blanket to the straw. The nearest girl recoiled anyway, shrinking back as if the fabric itself carried danger. Another cowboy set a coat nearby, his hands steady, his posture lowered to avoid towering over them. But the girls' reactions did not change. Their bodies drew inward, shoulders tightening, eyes darting toward the barn door as though searching for escape where none existed. When he offered the tin cup of warm water, holding it low and open, palmed, one girl reached out instinctively before her hand froze midair. She pulled back sharply, tucking her fingers beneath her blanket as if she had almost stepped into a trap. The cup trembled in the cowboy's grip before he quietly set it down on the straw. The cold had already taken its toll. Their breaths came in shallow bursts, their skin pale from exposure, their movements slow and unsteady. One girl swayed where she sat, blinking hard as though fighting the pull of sleep she could not afford. The cowboys exchanged troubled glances, each recognizing the urgency settling into the room like another layer of frost. They were running out of time. The storm outside threatened their bodies, but the fear inside the barn threatened their chance at survival. The lead cowboy stepped forward as if to try again, then stopped himself. He could see the strain in their eyes, the way their bodies tightened whenever he crossed a certain invisible line. So instead of approaching, he slowly backed away, each step measured, his hands lowered and open to show he meant no harm. When he reached the far side of the barn, he eased down onto an overturned crate, placing himself at a distance that made his presence felt but not feared. The effect was almost immediate. The girls, still huddled beneath blankets, seemed to loosen by a fraction. Their shoulders dropped slightly, as though the air around them had widened. The frantic rhythm of their breathing softened, becoming less like gasps and more like cautious attempts at calm. The barn, filled moments earlier with tension that clung to every corner, began to settle into a quieter stillness shaped not by fear, but by space. The cowboy remained still, resisting every instinct to rise and help. He understood that stepping back was its own kind of care, a way of letting them reclaim a small piece of control. Snow hissed against the barn walls, the lantern flame flickered, and the girls gradually lifted their heads from their knees. Not all at once, and not with confidence, but with the slow, fragile curiosity of people who had spent too long bracing for harm. One girl looked up first, her eyes searching the room before settling on the cowboy across the space. The glance was brief, just long enough for her to see that he hadn't moved, hadn't tried to advance, hadn't tried to touch. Then her gaze lowered again, but the moment lingered like a faint glow in the cold air. For the first time since entering the barn, trust, fragile, uncertain, but real, had taken its first quiet breath. A faint draft moved through the barn when the storm shifted, stirring the blankets the girls clutched around themselves. One corner of a scarf slipped loose as a girl adjusted her grip, and the lantern light caught the pale edge of skin beneath it. The cowboy noticed the change before she realized anything had shifted. He saw the faint discoloration along her neck, the telltale signs of cold that had bitten too deeply, and bruising that hinted at rough travel long before the blizzard found them. It was only a glimpse, small, unintentional, but enough to understand why their bodies trembled even in the warmth. He did not let his expression change. Years of reading cattle injuries, of seeing ranch hands shaken by accidents, had taught him to keep his face steady. But this was different. This was harm carried quietly, harm they tried to hide even now. He lowered his gaze, pretending to brush frost from his gloves, giving her time to pull the scarf back into place without the sting of being watched. When she did, her hands shook, trying to anchor the fabric, as if it were the last barrier she could still control. Inside him, something tightened. The sight of their fear had unsettled him before, but this small, fragile reveal deepened the conflict pulling at his thoughts. They were trapped between the cold that threatened their bodies and the terror that kept them from accepting help. He wanted to step forward, to offer warmth, reassurance, anything to ease the pain they carried. But he knew a single wrong move could drive them deeper into panic. So he remained where he was, letting compassion sit quietly inside him, waiting for a moment when it might reach them without causing harm. The storm outside beat against the walls, but the deeper storm lived in the space between them. He rose from the crate with slow, deliberate movements, careful not to disturb the quiet calm that had finally settled into the barn. The girls watched him with wary eyes, their bodies tightening slightly, but he did not approach them. Instead, he crossed to the hook near the door where an extra coat hung, thick, lined, and warm enough to cut through the worst of the wind. He folded it once, then carried it back with the same measured pace he had used all morning. When he reached the edge of their boundary, the invisible line beyond which fear surged, he stopped. He eased down to one knee, lowering himself until he was small in their view, neither towering nor threatening. Then he placed the coat on the straw with a gentle care that echoed through the silent barn. He did not slide it toward them. He did not gesture for them to take it. He simply set it down and stepped back, giving the space the dignity it required. The girls froze. Their eyes flicked from the coat to the cowboy and back again, confusion trembling across their faces. Kindness offered without demand was not something they had ever been taught to expect. For a moment, none of them moved, as if accepting the gesture might trigger some unseen consequence. Snow hissed faintly against the barn walls. The lantern flame swayed. The cowboy waited, hands at his sides, breath steady in the cold air. Finally, one girl reached forward. Her fingers hovered above the coat before curling around it with a hesitant grip. The fabric surprised her. Warm, soft, carrying the scent of horses and winter cedar. She drew it toward her chest, holding it in the same trembling way someone might hold a fragile truth they were not yet sure they deserved. The cowboy nodded once, not in triumph, but in quiet acknowledgment, then stepped farther back to let the moment unfold without pressure. A small fire crackled in a metal trough near the center of the barn, sending thin lines of steam into the cold air as the girls held their hands cautiously near the warmth. The coat the cowboy had left now rested around one of their shoulders, its heavy fabric swallowing her slight frame. She sat closer to the fire than before, breathing in slow, uneven pulls, as if testing whether safety could truly exist in a place she did not understand. The cowboys kept their distance. They leaned against stalls and beams, speaking in low murmurs about the storm and the drifting cattle, never mentioning the girls directly. Their quiet presence filled the space without pressing in on it, creating an unspoken agreement that nothing would be forced. The warmth from the fire mingled with the cold breath of winter, still seeping through the barn seams, forming a fragile balance the girls slowly began to settle into. The girl with the coat shifted slightly, her fingers brushing the fabric as though reminding herself it was really hers to hold. She glanced toward the cowboy, who had offered it. Not directly, but in the quick, uncertain way someone checks if danger is still watching. Instead of danger, she found him simply standing there, arms crossed loosely, face calm and steady. Her voice rose so quietly it almost vanished into the steam, lifting off the fire. "Thank you." The word was small, barely shaped, but it moved through the barn like a gentle break in the frost. The cowboys did not turn or step forward. They let the moment belong to her, allowing the gratitude to settle without overwhelming it. The other girls exchanged glances, their whispers softer now, no longer filled with warnings but with cautious curiosity. A few murmured to each other, testing their voices against the warmth that seemed to grow with every passing minute. The cowboys stayed where they were, silent witnesses to a shift too delicate to disturb. They sat closer to the fire that evening, the storm outside fading into a distant hum as drifting snow settled against the barn walls. The lantern glow softened the edges of the room, giving the girls a space where shadows did not feel like threats. Wrapped in blankets and the borrowed coat, they began to speak in low, halting voices, words shaped more by memory than by confidence. They spoke of the long transport routes, where cold had crept into their limbs until pain blurred into numbness. Some described injuries they tried to hide, bruises from falling during marches, skin burned by wind that cut through thin clothing. But their voices trembled most when they spoke of the months before capture, when fear had been taught to them as carefully as language. They had been warned that being seen by foreign men meant judgment, that showing weakness invited shame, that exposure of wounds, of tears, even of exhaustion, would mark them forever. One girl touched the edge of the coat as she explained how the blizzard winds had frightened her less than the moment a cowboy lifted her from the snow. The wind was a force of nature, indifferent and cold. Human hands, she had been told, carried intention. carried the power to reduce a person to something small, something unworthy. She had guarded herself so fiercely that even rescue felt like a danger she could not measure. They described how war had taken more than safety. It had taken identity, stripping away the roles they once understood, leaving them unsure of who they were allowed to be. They had learned to survive by shrinking themselves, by hiding injuries, by avoiding any touch might reveal how fragile they had become. The cowboys listened in silence, each story settling into the room like falling snow, soft, heavy, and impossible to ignore. The storm eased overnight, leaving the plains buried in stillness, and the barn settled into a gentler quiet that felt almost foreign after so much fear. The girls sat near the fading fire, their breaths rising in soft clouds, their blankets pulled close but no longer clenched with desperation. The cowboys watched from a respectful distance, sensing a shift that had less to do with warmth and more to do with something deeper, something neither side had expected to find in a frozen corner of Wyoming. The myths the girls carried had followed them across an ocean, shaping every reaction, every tremor, every collapse. Those warnings had painted American men as figures of cruelty, strangers who would break them the moment they fell into enemy hands. For so long, those beliefs had felt like truth, reinforced by silence, hardship, and the crushing weight of survival. Yet here, in a barn lit by lantern glow and warmed by shared breath, those myths began to lose their grip, not because of arguments, not because of force, but because of quiet, consistent kindness, a bowl of hot stew placed within reach without expectation, a coat left on straw with no demand attached, a fire tended through the night so the cold would not steal more strength from weary bodies. Each act was small, almost invisible, yet together they formed a bridge stronger than the warnings that once held the girls apart from the world. The lead cowboy understood it too. He had not broken through with words or authority, but with humility, the simple willingness to step back, to listen, to give space instead of taking it. The land had taught him long ago that storms shape people, but so does gentleness, offered at the right moment. In that barn, truth rose slowly, like dawn edging over snow-covered fields. War had divided them, fear had controlled them, but food, warmth, and quiet humanity had begun to heal what conflict had carved. The morning broke with a muted light, slipping through gaps in the barn's wooden boards and settling over the girls as they rested in a loose circle near the fire. The storm had passed, leaving the plains wrapped in a quiet that felt almost tender after the night's violence. The coat the cowboy had offered now lay across one girl's shoulders, its heavy folds warming her in a way no words ever could. She held it with a calm that had not existed the day before, tracing the seams as though memorizing the feeling of safety it represented. The other girls leaned against blankets that had once been mere protection from the cold, but had grown into symbols of something gentler. Proof that not every stranger's gesture carried danger, that care could enter a life without demanding anything in return. The barn, once filled with trembling silence and guarded breaths, carried a softer air now, shaped by the fragile trust that had taken root during the storm. Outside, the plains stretched wide and white, the snow reflecting a world that had shifted in ways no one could see from afar. Yet moments like these were repeated in scattered corners of the world during the final months of the war. Small acts of mercy offered by farmers, medics, nurses, and soldiers who chose compassion in places scarred by conflict. These quiet bridges rarely reached the pages of history, but they helped stitch together the humanity war had tried to tear apart. The cowboy watched as the girls eased closer to the warmth. Their shoulders no longer braced, their gazes lifted rather than lowered. He did not speak. He didn't need to. The coat around her shoulders, the blankets at their feet, and the calm settling over the barn spoke for him. War had divided them. But here, in the hush left after a blizzard, humanity began to heal what it could.